This is a general introduction to metaphysics. And come on, you got to like that subtitle, don't you? It's the ultimate quest for ultimate reality. So here's the problem. A lot of times, what appears to be the case is not the case. So this can happen in a variety of contexts, that what seems to be one thing is not reality. Appearance doesn't always match reality. So that's a basic problem that metaphysics is addressing. So there are general cases here. So one might be a situation where it's not suitable for our senses to function properly. So our senses are doing fine. It's just an environment in which it's not suitable for them to work well. So this could be an internal situation when our cognitive abilities are not processing our senses properly, or we can go ahead and add if our senses are impaired or inadequate. In other words, the problem might be with us, within us. That is one case. Or it could be external, a little bit more interesting, at least for our concerns here, when the environment is not conducive for our senses to work well. So of course, this is the case for detecting colors in darkness, right? We can't really tell from dark red to blue, really, when it's dark. Or when we see and look down a long, flat, dark surface road on a sunny day, and it appears to be water in the road, and our senses are working okay, but the environment is not, so we see an oasis. Or someone, for example, an illusionist, is deceiving us, making it appear like they are levitating or something appeared out of thin air when in fact it did not. So those are general cases, and we can resolve those through medicine, through physics, through investigations in a more normal way. So as an example of, you're all familiar with optical illusions. So the center dot in both of these, the left and the right, are actually the same size. Even though the one on the right looks a little bigger than the one on the left, they are, in fact, the same size. Or this diagram where it appears that the lines are moving in the section that you're not looking at, or there are many other illustrations like this where your eyes deceive you and it appears like there is motion when there is not. So, but those have to do with psychology and other natural sciences. So there's another general case when this might occur. And sometimes there's more to what we can detect with our senses. So for example, it appears that the Earth is very stable and not moving, but in fact it's moving on its axis, right? It appears that things like desks and tables are solid, but in fact, they aren't solid through and through, homogeneous, the same thing. So the conclusion is there's often a reality behind appearances, and doing metaphysics is getting at that reality. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Those two examples that I just used, isn't getting at reality the role of science? Isn't it science that tells us that the Earth is actually in motion and rotating on its axis? And isn't it science that tells us that the desk is not fully solid? Yes, okay, sure, that is correct. But science was born from philosophical and metaphysical questions. And more importantly, much more importantly, science just simply cannot get at all of reality. They cannot, science is incapable of addressing metaphysical questions that remain, the pure metaphysical questions that we're going to be talking about. So for example, there is a Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics, and there's a Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and empirically they do fine. And as I speak this as far as I know. These haven't been resolved. That one says the subatomic particle follows a specific path going from one place to another, and the other denies that. So they are empirically the same, but they are meaningfully different. Reality should match one of those two, and we simply don't know which one reality matches. Okay, so yes, that's an area of science, but there's a metaphysical question that remains, right? Even though the theories are empirically equal, right? They work as equally well. There's something behind the appearance that is a truth of the matter. And metaphysics is getting behind the limitations of science. So metaphysics addresses questions about reality, capital R, reality. For example, whether immaterial beings exist or immaterial things at all exist. If they do, what are they? Those things are outside the realm of science. Right? Science only investigates material things, but investigating immaterial things would be a task of metaphysics. So, what might that include? Well, the nature of numbers. Numbers are real, they exist, at least I believe so, and yet they are not physical things. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to say what color is 7 or how much does 8 weigh. That doesn't make sense. So numbers exist, but they are immaterial. Propositions, relations, these are other things that are immaterial that some people say exist. Possibilities, necessities, moral principles seem to exist, but they're not physical things. God, if God of the traditional concept of theism exists, God is not an immaterial, God is an immaterial being, not a material being. So setting the boundaries and methodology of science is actually a philosophical task. It involves reasoning much more than gathering data or analyzing empirical data. Doing philosophy of science is what sets the boundaries of science, and it is what tells us how to do science well. So science can't do the things that metaphysics can do. There's this important role for metaphysics in terms of getting at reality behind the appearances. So one might ask, what about religion? Doesn't religion do that? And certainly there are many similarities and overlapping concerns in the respective subject matters of religion and metaphysics, but typically the method is very different. So for religion, there is often an appeal to authority or an appeal to experiences, versus in metaphysics, rational inquiry is the primary method of doing metaphysics, despite the sections of bookstores that might be labeled metaphysics. A lot of those things aren't actual metaphysics in the philosophical sense. There is very little consensus about religious claims, so by and large, when we do metaphysics, we're not going to appeal to religious claims. We're not going to assume any religious claims, generally speaking, when we're doing metaphysics. But there is a great consensus about scientific claims among experts. And so when we do metaphysics, we might appeal to science. We may go ahead and borrow what we know from science and use that as we do metaphysics. So metaphysics, again, distinguishing it from science, it's investigating things that science can't, and distinguishing it from religion, primarily because of the methodology that's used. Philosophy of religion is an area that you might call religious studies, but this is obviously philosophy. It's often very metaphysical in nature. Metaphysical statements. What are metaphysical statements? What is it when we say something that we have to classify it as a metaphysical statement? When we are describing reality with a capital R there, reality, with no restrictions of reference. So we typically, when we do metaphysics, we don't restrict our claims to on Earth or in the 21st century. Now, it's possible to restrict it for certain types of things, like talking about the nature of humans. Obviously, we're restricting it to humans. And metaphysical statements are intended to be taken strictly and literally, at least in the analytic tradition that I follow. When you do metaphysics, you are really trying to speak the truth, so you say things carefully and concisely. Metaphysics makes use of general categories such as cause, event, property, physical thing, immaterial being, objectivity, relation, possibility, mental. These are all very broad, general categories, and metaphysics explores these general categories. By the way, I'm following a lot of what Peter van Inwagen does in his introductory text and his co-authored anthology with Dean Zimmerman. And I'm borrowing very heavily. Peter van Inwagen was my co-dissertation advisor, and so I'm very much influenced by him, and I should credit him with what is good in this video introducing metaphysics. Okay. Putting that aside, now we're doing metaphysics when we reason about these types of statements, statements about these categories that are very broad, where we're trying to get at reality. And we're reasoning, are they true? Are they probable? Are they consistent with other beliefs? That's, of course, doing philosophy. Now, a little comment here. I said metaphysical statements should be taken as true and literal statements. And it's one of my pet peeves that this word literally is often misused. So this woman says she literally exploded when she found her boyfriend with her sister. And that's just simply a misuse of the word. And sometimes we have to give up, like uses of words change over time, and sometimes philosophers really want to hang on to phrases like beg the question, which has a technical meaning in philosophy, but it's being misused by so many people. But I don't know what's going to take the place of the word literally if we give up on this. So it's a little bit irritating when I hear this misused. And I do mean that we need to take metaphysical statements literally. All right, what are some kinds of metaphysical questions? Well, metaphysicians investigate the question of what are the most general features of the world? What exists? This is doing ontology, which is the investigation of being qua being, being insofar as it is being. Another area is why is there something rather than nothing? You may have pondered this at some time in your life. That is a metaphysical question. Metaphysics investigates these kinds of first principles. What is our place in the world? This can be and often is a metaphysical question. What kind of beings are humans? We're not talking about biology here. Obviously, that could be taken as a biological question, but we mean this as a metaphysical question, and that is very interesting to pursue. We're doing metaphysics when we propose answers and rationally evaluate those proposals, answers to these kinds of questions, and then investigate the arguments for or against those proposals. That is doing metaphysics. Now, oddly, through the history of philosophy, there have been times when people have questioned the possibility of doing metaphysics. And some claim that metaphysics is not possible. There are two reasons people might claim this. One, because they claim there is no reality to be described. That's a strong thesis, and ultimately it is self-defeating. It doesn't make any sense to claim that, but despite that, many people have tried to argue for the truth of that claim. It simply doesn't make sense, though. Another thesis that metaphysics is impossible might be because describing reality is beyond our powers. That's the weaker thesis. here I'm certainly borrowing directly from Peter van Inwagen, and one general type of person that denies reality is the anti-realist. That's not van Inwagen, but his chapter on objectivism addresses anti-realism. His chapter in his introductory book, Metaphysics, we'll do another video on that, addresses objectivism and anti-realism, and he's not an anti-realist, but he is a person who is questioning the ability of humans to do metaphysics. Back to philosophers who have claimed that we can't do metaphysics. One branch of philosophy that did this was in the mid-20th century, early mid-20th century. Logical positivism got started. And the main thesis of logical positivism is the idea that a statement is meaningful if and only if it is analytic, that is a definition of language, like all bachelors are unmarried adult males. That's an analytic statement, so that has meaning. Or it's a synthetic statement that is empirically testable, something that we could turn over to science to investigate. Now, that doesn't leave room for metaphysical claims, right? Metaphysical claims are neither analytic nor synthetic. So the logical positivists concluded that they are meaningless. Now, logical positivism has been thoroughly refuted by philosophers. It's one of those rare cases where philosophers pretty much almost unanimously agree as a failure, but oddly, it's been exported, and there are people who affirm logical positivism. Sometimes scientists, I've spoken to contemporary biologists who affirm a version of logical positivism, and other scientists. The idea then that metaphysics is impossible and all we have is science. And I have a different video on the topic of scientism. That's the contemporary version of logical positivism. And you can watch that video to see why I think that that is an ultimate failure. So why is this a problem? Why is logical positivism self-refuting? Well, just consider the claim itself. The claim that a statement is meaningful if and only if it is analytic or synthetic. Is that statement analytic? No, it's not. It's not. It doesn't flow from a definition of any kind. Is that statement synthetic? Is it the kind of thing that can be investigated by science? No, it's not. Well, that means that the main thesis of logical positivism, if logical positivism is true, it's meaningless, which means it can't be true, right? So that's what we mean by self-defeating there. Okay, so there are adherents of the weak thesis. We said that humans just aren't very good at this or can't do it. And in a sense, metaphysics is impossible, may be the claim, because there is a reality to describe, but our human minds are incapable of resolving important metaphysical questions. Kant had this, I would call is a somewhat strong, weak thesis, because he claims any mind that represents external reality by means of internal states will be incapable of getting at reality. So we've got this problem as humans that we depend on this, doing this, and we just can't get outside of our minds, and so we can't really do metaphysics. We can never get at ultimate reality. As I mentioned, van Inwagen is a contemporary philosopher who adheres to the weak thesis, but to a much lesser extent. His view is that humans just aren't very good at doing metaphysics. Maybe other intellectual beings could be really good at doing metaphysics, but we're not. It's kind of like a gymnast who is excellent at doing gymnastics, but compared to a chimpanzee, they just can't move nearly as well as that. Of course, yes, van Inwagen is a metaphysician, and in fact, I'll go ahead and say I consider him one of the greatest metaphysicians living today. Okay, what's the value of metaphysics? First of all, metaphysics is one of the four main branches of philosophy. It's extremely important for most other philosophical inquiries. So when you start to do philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, you are going to need a metaphysical background, right? It becomes important even sometimes when you're doing moral theory, political theory. You never know when metaphysics is significant in doing other parts of philosophy. And then studying metaphysics has that advantage of developing really important intellectual skills. If you can understand these difficult texts and be able to explain them, you are going to develop the skill of doing that broadly speaking and then communicating clearly. If you can do metaphysics well, you're going to be able to succeed in almost any area of inquiry. And that's another reason why I value metaphysics and, of course, studying philosophy in general.